Well, tonight we're continuing our study through the book of Acts, chapter 27, verses 9 through 20. We are in the last major section in the book of Acts, and it's called Paul's Journey to Rome and Witness in Rome. And that's chapters 27 and 28. We began last week with Paul's journey to Rome. And 3/4 of the last two chapters are about the journey to Rome. Luke was there on the boat with Paul, and basically he gives us almost a diary of what takes place on this journey. And 3/4 of the last two chapters are about that particular story. So there's a lot of details in this story. Last week we began with the journey to Fair Havens, and in many ways that was leg number one of this journey. I just want to review, and tonight I've given you the same map that's up here so that you can easily, hopefully, follow along as we take this journey. But it started down here in Caesarea, and a very easy trip over to Sidon. And again, ancient ships, they like to follow the coastline. An ancient ship did not want to get out in the middle of the water, not knowing where it was located or where it was supposed to be going. From Sidon, they make their way to Myra, and they go north of Cyprus, and that was very helpful because of the winds. It gave them a break and a buffer from the wind. They make it to Myra, which was a very important seaport, because grain ships from Alexandria, Egypt, would go due north and end up at Myra. The Romans got a lot of grain from Egypt, and so these grain ships would leave Alexandria and eventually get all the way up to Rome. And to make that journey, their first stop would be at Myra. At Myra, Paul and everyone on the boat, they changed boats. They were on a fairly small boat when they left Caesarea. It was a boat that probably wouldn't make it all the way to Rome, but now they're on a grain boat. Back in the first century, the Romans basically leased these boats from people. So the boat was owned by a private individual. The Romans would pay this individual to transport the grain. And if there was room left on the boat, there could be passengers, and in this case, prisoners, including Paul, who was going to Rome. So from Myra, their next stop is in Fair Havens, but that's not really where they wanted to go. The wind was against them. They ran into some slight issues traveling. They really wanted to go to Salmone, but the north wind pushed them further south, and they end up in Fair Havens. So Salmone would have been a nice place to spend the winter. Also, Phoenix would have been a nice place to spend the winter. But because of the winds, they end up in Fair Havens. And that's where we left him last week. The next section is called The Decision to Sail On. Now that they're at Fair Havens, they have a decision to make. Should they stay there for the winter, or should they try to move to another location and stay somewhere else during the winter months? So let me read those verses, chapter 27, verses 9 through 12, and then we'll talk about that section. So Acts chapter 27, beginning with verse 9. Much time had been lost, and sailing had become dangerous, because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and our own lives too." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. So the big decision is, where are we going to spend the winter months? Because they're not going to make it to Rome before winter. So they're going to have to stop somewhere. So in verse 9, much time had been lost. So they really didn't want to end up in Fair Havens, but once they get there, they're stuck there for a while. Apparently, weather conditions were not favorable for sailing, and they are just kind of waiting for an opportunity to move forward. And so now they have a decision that they need to make. Do they just stay, or do they take the risk of moving forward? And one of the things about decision making, when we're rushed, when time's against us, we often don't make the best decisions. And that's what they're facing too. And Luke tells us right at the beginning that much time had been lost. Things were not moving according to schedule. Sailing had become dangerous because now it was after the fast. The fast is actually the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was celebrated either in late September or early October, depending upon the moon that they used to determine that. And if this is AD 59, which a lot of scholars believe it is, then the Day of Atonement would be October the 5th. And that is important for this reason. There's a Roman military writer. His name is, see if I can get it here, Vegetus, and he has written a lot about traveling by sea. And according to him, after September the 15th, it's very dangerous to travel by sea. And he also goes on to say that from November the 11th until March the 10th, sea travel was definitely out. This man was very cautious. Some others would disagree with his dates, but of course, if you're on the boat, you want to be cautious. And so this man took a very cautious approach to traveling by sea just to make sure that he kept himself safe and everyone else. So if it's October the 5th, then it would at least be dangerous to travel by sea at this point. And so Paul is going to agree and say we should not travel. And so he says in verse 10, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." There's a big question about whether Paul gives his opinion based upon his experience, or does he have some kind of divine knowledge at this point that it would be a really bad idea to continue this journey by sea. Most scholars agree that Paul is probably just giving his opinion for a couple of reasons. Paul does have some experience at sea. According to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, Paul says that he suffered shipwreck 3 times. And he also says that he spent a day and night out in the open water, which for an ancient person, that was, you don't want to be out in the open water not knowing where you are. But Paul had experienced that. So Paul, based upon his own experience, would want to be very cautious about traveling by sea. I mean, he's already experienced 3 shipwrecks. I mean, you could conclude that he's bad luck. You know, he doesn't have very good luck when he's out at sea. So traveling during a dangerous time was not a good idea for him. Paul also says that if we do this, we're going to suffer great loss to the ship, to the cargo, and even our own lives. And that would seem logical. If the ship went down, if the ship wrecked, chances are you're going to lose the cargo and you're going to lose lives as well. If you've read ahead in the story, you know that the ship and the cargo do get lost. They get destroyed. But nobody dies in the story. So Paul's warning at this point may have just been based upon his own logic and what he was thinking, looking at the situation. But Luke's point is they should have listened to Paul. Paul was the one who had the best advice, but others have a different opinion. The centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Apparently, this is indeed a grain ship that's going all the way from Alexandria, Egypt, all the way up to Rome. And the Romans treasured their grain. They needed the grain. And so they would often put centurions, Roman military officers, on the boats to protect the cargo. They did not want bandits to come along or anyone to come along and steal the grain. So they put soldiers on the boat to protect the cargo. And so because of that, the highest ranking officer on the boat would become the centurion, and he would have the final say. And apparently he's asking for people's opinions, and he gets the opinion of the captain and also the owner of the boat, and it's their opinion that they should move forward. Paul's was a very different opinion. He said that they should stay put. So he gets to make the final decision. And apparently Julius, who is the centurion in this case, is going to follow the opinion of the experts, the captain and the owner of the boat. And we don't know if the captain, the pilot, and the owner are the same person or two different people. A lot of owners of boats were also the captain of their boat. Their boat was their livelihood. It's how they made their money. And so often they didn't trust anyone to be the captain of their own boat. They did that themselves. So we're not sure in this case. But why would the owner of the boat, who was ultimately responsible for the boat, and the captain, who was in charge of navigation, want to take a risk? And verse 12 tells us, they believed that the harbor at Fair Havens was unsuitable to winter in. In the winter, the winds come from the north and the east. And Fair Havens was exposed, especially with the wind coming from the east. That would make that a not safe place to harbor for the winter. And they were afraid that the boat would be damaged, and so they decide to move on. They want to sail on to reach Phoenix and winter there. Phoenix is only about 40 to 50 miles from Fair Havens. It's west of Fair Havens. It's right along the coast. So if they can catch a breeze coming from the south, they should be able to very easily make their way along the shore of Crete and go from Fair Havens to Phoenix. At least that's the goal. And Phoenix faces southwest and northwest, which means the east wind is not going to be as big of an issue as it would be at Fair Havens. So logically, that seems to make a whole lot of sense. So here's Fair Havens, kind of right in the middle, and Phoenix is just a little bit west, about 40 to 50 miles, and the goal is to make it to Phoenix, which looks like a pretty easy thing to do. Well, we're not exactly sure how this decision was made, but as we look at what happens, it could have been a meeting that was called, perhaps by the centurion, to give people an opportunity to express their opinion about whether they should stay at Fair Havens or move on. It is somewhat strange that Paul, a prisoner, gets to express his opinion. You know, you would not think that you would go ask the prisoners what we ought to do. But we do know from the previous story that Julius, the centurion, allows Paul to go ashore at Sidon and visit some Christian friends. So apparently they already have a good relationship, and Paul returns no problem to the boat. And so it could have been that the centurion asked Paul privately, you may have some experience at sea. What do you think we should do? Or it could have been they were all in a room and debating back and forth as to what should take place. But at the end of the story, Paul seems to stand pretty much alone and in the minority. The owner of the boat, the captain of the boat say, let's move on to Phoenix. And in verse 12, it says that the majority said that they should move on to Phoenix. So I don't know if they took a vote or how they did this, but for the centurion, it seems as though everybody is telling him, let's move on, except Paul. He seems to be the only one who is suggesting that they stay. This raises a question. How do we make decisions? How do you make decisions as an individual? How do you make decisions as a family? And how do we make decisions as a church? We could even go beyond that and say, how do we make decisions as a country, if you want to go that far? Well, there are some options, and one is majority opinion. We'll just go with the majority. But I find it fascinating that there are at least 2 stories in the Bible where the majority get it absolutely wrong. You think you're safe, relying upon majority opinion. But Moses sends 10 spies into the promised land to spy out the land and come back and give a report. 10 of the 12 say, no, we can't go into the promised land and defeat those people and take their land. Compared to us, they're like giants, and they have weapons that we don't have. Their people are militarily trained, and if we try to attack them, they'll squash us like bugs. So 10 of the 12 get it wrong. And because of that, they get to walk around in circles for 40 years. In this story, the majority get it wrong. As it turns out, Paul is the only one who gives the right opinion as the story progresses. So relying on the majority is not necessarily a safe thing to do. Another way to basically make a decision is to ask the experts. The experts ought to know what to do. If you want to know if it's safe to travel by sea or not, ask the owner of the boat or the captain of the boat. They ought to know. But in this case, they're wrong. Another way to make an opinion is just to simply go with your gut and say, I'm going to do what I want to do, and that settles it. You may have to ask yourself what your track record is when you do that. A fourth way to make a decision is to ask God what you ought to do. And from what we know about Paul, chances are that was his approach. He asked God about what he should do. So we make decisions all the time. So how do you make decisions is a good question, because they had a decision to make. And as it turns out, they made the wrong one. Well, we're going to move on to the next section, which is called the Northeaster. And we find that in verses 13 through 20. Let me read those verses, and then we'll come back and take a look at them one by one. So Acts chapter 27, picking up the story with verse 13. It says, when a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the Northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So, what an incredible story. What an incredible experience. And it could have been about this time that Luke and Aristarchus, who are on the boat with Paul, were thinking, why in the world did I do this? There was nothing probably more fearful in the ancient world than to be lost at sea. It was a horrible feeling, and they are going to be lost at sea for 14 days. I mean, think about that. That's 2 weeks. Out in the middle of the water. You have no idea where you are. You are at the mercy of the wind and the storm, and you're thinking at this point that I'm going to die at sea. This is how my story's going to end. The boat's going to crash, the boat's going to come apart, and my life is going to be over. And that's what everyone was thinking. Verse 13 talks about a gentle south wind. And that's exactly what they were looking for, because a gentle south wind would enable them to make it from Fair Havens to Phoenix. The south wind would blow them ever so slightly north, which meant that they could hug the coastline. And that was the safest way to travel by boat in the first century. Hug the coastline. Stay as close to it as you possibly can. And again, the distance from Fair Havens to Phoenix is about 40 to 50 miles. About 6 miles west of Fair Havens, there was a cape, Cape Matola. And Cape Matola, it doesn't show it very well on the map, but to get around the cape, you have to go south just a little bit. So you would have to go south, then after you went around the cape, then you had to go back north. And I think that turns out to be the problem. The fact that they had to go south was no big deal. If that southern wind had continued, it would have blown them north, and it would have been an easy journey. In fact, this journey by boat should have taken less than a day, maybe even a half day, if weather conditions had proven to be more favorable. So it should have been an easy thing to do. But right about the time they get around the cape, something happens. A wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. So on Crete, there were several mountains, some of them as high as 7,000 feet above sea level. And that's where the winds would come, the violent wind. And a violent wind coming down from the mountain hit the boat broadside. And chances are they were right there at the cape. And they were going south, and now they needed to go north. But the wind came from the north and blew them south, right where they did not want to be. So that becomes the big issue. It's a wind of hurricane force. It's a whirling cyclonic wind. And it was basically caused because of the clash of opposing air masses, which I'm not a weatherman, but apparently when there's those air masses that clash, you get some very violent storms. And this was the dreaded northeaster. It was the winter storm of the Mediterranean. And because of that, it would blow the boat south and west, because the wind would come out of the north and the east. And that's a problem for this boat that needs to go north, but the wind is coming out of the north and will blow the boat to the south. Verse 15 says the ship was caught by the storm. It could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. Ancient boats were not built to withstand a storm. And when the wind was blowing that hard, there was no way that you can go into the wind and make progress. It just doesn't work that way with an ancient ship. So there was no way this Alexandrian ship was ever going to make it to Phoenix. because to get to Phoenix, it needed to go north and west. But the wind is going to blow it south and west. The crew is unable to steer the boat into the wind. They can't face the wind head on and make any progress. And so as Luke writes, he says, we gave way to the wind. In other words, we put down the sail and just let the wind blow the boat wherever it was going to blow the boat. Because at that point, there was nothing they could do. They were absolutely at the mercy of the wind, and they were driven along by the wind. That's a terrible place to be in the ancient world. To be on a boat out in the middle of the water, there's a violent storm, and you no longer have control over the boat. The wind has control over the boat, which means the wind also has control over you. Verse 16, as we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So let me go to the map, and you have this map. So as they're going to Fair Havens, they want to reach Phoenix, and again, they need to go north, but the wind is coming from the north. It blows it south. There's no way they're going to make it to Phoenix. But apparently there's a small island that's not even quite pictured on here called Cauda or Clauda, as it's sometimes known in the literature. And they do get a break. They don't actually stop at the island. They pass by the island, but the island is a buffer for the wind. And it enables them to secure the boat at least a little bit. And the first thing they want to do is to make the lifeboat secure. The lifeboat was located on the stern of the boat, and during a storm in the ancient world, it was advised to bring in the lifeboat. The lifeboat is filled with water at this point, so it's extremely heavy. And that's why Luke says that we were hardly able to make it secure. And the fact that Luke uses the word we may indicate that even Luke was out there along with some other passengers trying to haul in the lifeboat, which happened to be very heavy. And again, a storm is going on at the same time as they're trying to do this. So they need to make the boat secure. The first thing they do is bring in the lifeboat. Beginning with verse 17, Luke gives us some information about two other things that they did to make the lifeboat secure. The problem is we're not exactly 100% sure what Luke is talking about. Biblical scholars normally are not ancient boat experts. So in many ways, they're guessing about what Luke is talking about. The first thing that he talks about in verse 17 is they undergird the ship once they get the lifeboat back up. And Luke uses some interesting language for that. To undergird the ship, it basically means to tie some ropes or cables underneath. The word for cables means helps. That's the word that he uses. And in your notes, there are 4 different options about what they might have done. Basically, what they were trying to do is to tie ropes or cables around the boat to keep it from breaking apart in the wind. So they were trying to make the boat more secure. And exactly what they did, we're really not sure. I was looking for a picture of what this boat may have looked like. And all the pictures I found on the internet were way too small for how big this boat must have been. I mean, they were showing little boats, but you've got a lot of people on this boat. You also have a lot of cargo on this boat. This was a huge boat, but at the same time, being made out of wood, it could break apart in the storm, and if it breaks apart in the storm, then lives will be lost. So they do undergird the boat. The third thing that they do is they lower the sea anchor. And that is the NIV's interpretation of what Luke actually writes. Basically, Luke writes, they lowered the equipment. And the question is, what equipment are you talking about? And there's a lot of different options. The best option is probably they lowered a drifting anchor that would drag in the water and slow down their progress. Again, they're not navigating the boat. The wind is navigating the boat. And the last thing they want to do is get this boat completely out of control. And one of the things they wanted to avoid is to end up in Syrtis, which happens to be about 400 miles away. However, there were a lot of sand dunes in, is that what those are called? In Syrtis, sandbars. There were sandbars in a lot of low areas in Syrtis. So if the boat ends up here, it's going to hit one of those, and that's going to be the end of the story. And again, they have no idea where they are. They just know if they go far enough south, they could hit a sandbar or some shallow water, and that would be the end of them. And even as this little diagram of where the boat may have gone, it's way up here, but there's also this line down here because we really don't know how far south the boat went. We're going to eventually find out where it lands, but we have no idea how far south that boat actually drifted. And so this is just one author's interpretation of how far south they may have gone. They may have gone a lot further south, but this was the area to avoid, and there were all kinds of stories about Syrtis and the sandbars, and so they knew they had to avoid that area. And so by dropping anchor, hopefully it would slow the boat down. So, in verse 18, they have another problem. Chances are they're taking in some water. There's some leaks. With an ancient boat, that's certainly understandable. So you need to make the boat lighter so it can ride higher on the water. And that means getting rid of some stuff, including the cargo. Now, you can picture yourself as the owner of the boat. He needs to deliver that cargo to Rome so he can be paid. So as they're throwing the cargo overboard, in his mind, they're throwing money overboard. That's going to be his income, and they're throwing it overboard because they really have no choice. They have to make the boat lighter. So then in verse 19, on the third day, and this is the third day of the storm, the ship's tackle was also thrown overboard. And this was apparently a big pole that held up the mast. And at that point, they're thinking, we don't need this anymore because we're not going to put the sails up. We're keeping the sails down. So we don't need this anymore, so they throw it in the water as well. And it says they do it with their own hands. It was apparently long enough that it took many of them to throw that into the water. So things are going from bad to worse. And in verse 20, when neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So this storm will actually continue for 14 days, for 2 weeks. And during that time, they're not able to see the sun or the stars. It's cloudy, and they can't see anything. Back in ancient days, they did not have a compass to guide them. They looked at the sun and the stars to figure out where they were. The problem is they can't see the sun or the stars, which means they have no idea where they are. And that sense of being lost at sea, where are we? Where will we end up? And they're all thinking, well, chances are we're going to end up hitting something we wish we would not have hit, and the boat will crumble, and we're going to be thrown into the water and lost at sea. That's their thinking. The storm continues raging, and eventually they give up all hope of being saved. One of the great characteristics of God as you read through the Bible is that God tends to intervene when things reach their lowest level. Now, from our perspective, we wish God would intervene when things just begin to get a little bad. You know, things are getting a little bad, God, so why don't you just fix this? But that's not how the story goes. The story goes that the storm lasts for 14 days. God doesn't intervene on day 1 or even day 2 and cause the storm to go away. God intervenes at the last possible moment. The moment when everybody gives up hope. That seems to be the moment when God intervenes. As I read the story of the last days in the book of Zechariah, chapter 12, chapter 14, Jerusalem is surrounded by enemies. And I'm sure that all the news reports of that day will indicate that whoever the Antichrist is about to take Israel and make Jerusalem his capital city. And that's the way the newspapers are going to read that day, because Jerusalem will be surrounded. There's nothing the Jewish people can do any longer to defend themselves. This is the end of the line. And when it looks like all is lost, that's when Jesus comes back to defeat the enemies and claim Jerusalem for himself. Jesus doesn't show up when the armies first get to around Israel and begin to surround it. No, he doesn't show up until it looks like Jerusalem will absolutely be taken over by enemies. It seems to be one of the characteristics of God that he kind of waits to see who's going to give up hope and who's still going to have faith before he intervenes. And that seems to be the story in this episode of Paul's life, this sea journey. Once verse 20 states everybody gives up hope. We'll look at it next week, but beginning in verse 21, God begins to give hope to the people. You may look at your own life about those moments when God intervened for you and how God may have waited till the last possible second to finally intervene and rescue the situation. That's the way God often works in people's lives. You know, you go back to the Old Testament in the Joseph story, and he has to wait all of these years before God finally intervenes. And you're wondering, why didn't God intervene a whole lot sooner? God seems to wait to the last possible moment. God has a timetable, and it doesn't seem to be his timetables the same as ours. Because we're thinking, wouldn't it be great, you know, day 1 or day 2 of the storm that God intervenes and Paul does, you know, one of those Jesus numbers and goes out and says, "Peace be still," and the storm goes away. But that's not how the story goes. Jesus did that, and the storm immediately went away. But for Paul, he has to go through 14 days of this storm. Does God allow his people to go through storms and rough times? Yeah, he does. But God has an answer at the end of the story. And it seems to be, more times than not, that things have to get really ugly. And it looks like all hope is gone and everything's going to be lost. And that's when God shows up. It's interesting how Luke phrases this. We finally gave up all hope of being saved or rescued. But the word saved has a special meaning for Christians. We often say to one another, "Are you saved?" It talks about our spiritual salvation, our faith in Christ rescuing us from our sin. And Luke uses that same word in this particular story. And you wonder if there's not some symbolism that Luke is driving at. Because of God's intervention, because of the fact that Paul's on the boat and God made a promise to Paul that you're going to Rome, you will stand trial before Caesar. Because God made that promise, God's going to keep his promise. Paul somehow has to survive and make it to Rome, which in this case means that everybody on the boat is also going to be saved, rescued, and make it to Rome. So everybody on the boat's going to experience some kind of physical rescue, some physical salvation. But it also makes us wonder about spiritual salvation. Obviously, as this story progresses, everybody's going to realize that Paul has got a connection with God unlike anything they've ever experienced in their life. And Paul knows something that they don't know. And I'm sure somewhere along the line, Paul shared his faith with everybody on the boat. Although Luke doesn't record it, interestingly enough. But he does get the reader thinking. They're going to experience physical salvation. But what they really need as well is spiritual salvation. And the same one who provides physical salvation can also provide spiritual salvation as well. As we wrap things up, there's a lot of similarities between this story and the story of Jonah. Jonah was God's prophet. Paul happens to be God's apostle. They both end up on a boat. They both get caught in a storm. In both cases, the crew on the ship throws the cargo into the water, and they fear for their life. And in both cases, nobody dies. Everybody gets rescued. But there's a big difference between the two stories. The storm comes because Jonah is on the boat. And once Jonah leaves the boat, the storm goes away. But in Paul's case, the fact that he's on the boat means that everybody's going to get rescued. Rescue comes from Paul's presence on the boat because God made Paul a promise. And God's going to keep his promise. An incredible story. And again, I cannot even imagine being lost at sea on an ancient boat for 14 days and what that must do to your faith. You know, in our lives, when something little goes wrong, sometimes our faith gets called into question. When something big goes wrong, our faith really gets called into question. 14 days on a boat, not knowing if you would live or die, that would call your faith into question. And next week we're going to look at how God does intervene and how Paul responds to God's intervention. And Paul is the one who has faith. Everyone else, they've given up all hope. But Paul has faith because he believes God's message. And here we are in a world that's crazy chaotic right now. And it's a world where a lot of people's faith is being questioned and challenged. But we know how the story ends if we believe the back of the book of Revelation. That in the end, all believers in Jesus Christ are resurrected to life everlasting with Him. So no matter what happens between now and then, we know how the story ends. It ends with a resurrection, and it ends in glory. And in between, we are called to faith, to trust God, and not to fall into the category of giving up all hope. Well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this story. Father, what an incredible story. A story that none of us would like to experience. A story of great challenge. A story of great emotional ups and downs. A story where it looks like all is lost and there's no hope whatsoever. But Father, we know that because of you, we always have hope. We have hope of life everlasting in you. And we have hope that all of your promises are true. And if you said it, we can count on it. So, Father, may we live as people of faith in a world that's crazy, stormy, difficult right now. May we anchor our faith in your promises and in the things that you say are true. And may our faith grow as we go through our own storms in our own lives. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.